handle. It really has to be you guys who decide what's going to go on the bond, what our community can handle, and what they're going to support. And so I think it's really important that your voices in this committee will help us find just that right thing for our district. So I'm glad you're here. Thank you for saying yes. I know it's summer, people are going to be traveling. So we're going to do our best to accommodate you, try and put some of this on Zoom meetings so that y'all can still be at your tables and participating with your group, but have the opportunity to also support your vacation schedule and all the things you've got going on with your family. So we'll send that information out to y'all for next week for those of you who cannot be here for me. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. This is meeting one, Wednesday the 8th. Y'all just got a tour of Sycamore Springs Middle School, and hope you got to see some really great things about this campus. And we will use that as an opportunity to tour other campuses to talk about differences between this, Dripping Springs Middle School, and kind of our academic programs and the way that we want to support student learning as we go forward. So I want to start with welcome and introductions. I'm Holly Morris, who's, for those of you who don't know me, I'm superintendent in the district. I've been here for a year. I have 3 kids. My oldest is Timothy, who's 26, lives in South Austin. My daughter just graduated from my former district. And then I have a sophomore at the high school who will be a junior next year who just got his first car. So we are having a great family summer with one graduated senior and one who's really learning to drive. And boy, he took me to Home Depot last night and we made it on 290. So, so I thought I'd just have y'all go around and we'll start with table 1 and just do introductions so that everybody has a chance. I've already seen y'all sitting down and meeting people who are at your table. So I want to make sure we all know a little bit about each other in the room. So we'll start over here.
I
am Sarah Blakely. I have 4 daughters. They will be a 9th grader, 6th grader, 1st grader, and pre-kindergartner next year. So I am at all of the ends of this. I talk a lot, and I do. That's something natural about me. I subbed in the district the 2nd semester, and I did all my observation hours actually in this building to get my alternative teaching license.
Chris Davis. I've got a daughter who is on the Dean's List going her junior year at Texas Tech, so proud of her. And then I've got boys in, I guess, 12 and 9, so going to Dripping Springs Middle School in Walnut. And my wife has been substitute teaching to support the teachers through COVID. Not that she does by trade. She's like, whatever I can do to help. So, know a lot of the struggles schools have gone through. Before I was an ambassador, I think before COVID, the ambassador program. So, just really enjoyed getting in and what we can do to help and advise. And, general contractor as well. And, a lot of schools in Central Texas and building all over the state.
Dustin Cloutier. I have a son starting 5th grade at Sycamore Springs Elementary School. My daughter starting 4th grade next year at Sycamore Springs Elementary. I will have a construction background, commercial, contractor.
Jeremy Lopez, resident of Dripping Springs for 4 years. Native Austin. My wife and I, we moved out here about some 4 years ago. We have 3 boys in the district, 1 at Walnut and 2 at the high school, and I am a general contractor by trade.
Kent Willis. I've lived here for 19 years. My wife is the attendant clerk at middle school and a graduate of Dripping Springs. My oldest son graduated in 2017. My middle graduated in 2019. And my youngest will be a senior in high school next year.
I'm Angela Stewart, and I have 3 boys. They go to Sycamore Springs Elementary. Coming up on a 3rd grader and a 1st grader, and my youngest is 3. We've been here for 8 years. I'm a native Texan, but we moved to Austin, Dripping Springs there 8 years ago, and we love the school. Happy to help.
Hi, I'm Michael Brock. I've got a boring life story. I'll tell it to you real quick. I started dating my wife when I was 15 and I never left. Came to school in Austin in 1990 and I never left. Started working for my company 26 years ago and I never left. Dripping Springs 19 years ago and I plan to never leave. So, we've had 6 kids in the district 6 girls, girl dad. Youngest is a sophomore at the high school this year. So, and I've got some background in construction. I'm a structural engineer, so I work with architects, like they're designing the skeletons of buildings.
I'm Jenny Perry. I am new to the district. I've been here 2 years, and I have a 7-year-old at Cypress Springs Elementary. And I'm a former art teacher in a East Austin district that I've done fine arts administrator for the district. So I'm very familiar with facilities and renovations for those types of spaces. I currently work for a statewide nonprofit advocating for the arts and arts education. And we love Dripping Springs ISD. That's why we moved here.
Thomas Lingle, I've got a incoming senior and incoming freshman, luckily. We've lived out here for going on 7 years. I'm from Austin originally, and I'm in the commercial printing business, and my wife's in tech.
Jennifer Rodriguez. I also have 4 daughters, and 3 have graduated from the school district, including last month, had 1, and my youngest will be a sophomore. I've been out here for about 15 years, and served on previous bond steering committee. In my day job, I do legislative consulting at the state and local levels.
I'm Garrett Crom. We've been in Dripping for 10 years, and our house is now 10 years old, and it seems like everything is falling apart this summer. So a bunch of summer projects. I have 3 kids. The oldest is going to be 12 and entering the middle school here, and then I have 2 in elementary school. One's going to be a 4th grader, and the other is going to be a kindergartner. And my background is in finance.
Hi, I'm Susie Robbins, and we've been here in Drip for about 6 years. I have a son who will be a junior at the high school next year and a daughter that graduated in 2021. We moved here from a neighboring district because we weren't having our kids weren't being served to their fullest. Like my son has pretty severe ADHD and high functioning autism, and my daughter tested as a gifted and talented student. So we moved here because we knew that Dripping Springs could give them what they needed. And that's why I hope I'm on this committee, because I hope it stays that way for other kids.
I'd like to have our board introduce themselves, if you don't mind. We've got a couple of trustees who are here to observe, so I want to make sure that we recognize them. Mary Jane, come on, start.
Mary Jane Hendrick, been here since 2012 and on the board since 2015.
And then our 2 newest board members are here. We're so glad they're joining us. So you want to start off, Tricia?
Trisha Quintero, I have 5 kids and 4 that will be rolling through the district, but I've been here. We moved in on the pandemic and then just kind of shut down. So been here for a couple of years, but excited to be here.
Olivia Bernard, in the district since 2014. I have a 3rd grader at Cypress, and we love it, and very recently elected to the board, so very happy to be here.
And then I want to make sure we introduce staff in the room. So Cindy, you want to start us off?
Sure. Cindy Wade, I'm Director of Technology. I've been in the district since 2004.
My name is James Conkle. I'm recently into the district too. I came here from Leander. This is my 16th year working in school construction. I'm head of the construction department.
Clint Pruitt, I'm Director of Facilities and Construction. I've been here since 2017. I think I literally started in the district the week that Sycamore opened back in the 17-18 school year.
I'm Karen Kidd, Assistant Superintendent for Learning and Innovation. I've been here for 2 years, and I come from a fast growth district in the North Texas area.
My name's Jennifer Edwards. I'm the Executive Director of Communications for the district. Been with the district about 6 months, but I'm also a parent. I have 3 kids in schools here, 2 at the high school and 1 rising from Sycamore over to Sycamore Middle. So happy to be here.
I'm Catherine Knapp. I'm the Assistant Superintendent for Finance and Operations. I've been in the district since October. Prior to that, I was a school finance consultant, helping districts all over the state with all sorts of matters of things. And I grew up in Eames ISD, and my mom was on the board there, so long history of kind of school finance stuff. And his kids were one of my original students when I was a teacher. So it's a good thing I was nice during parent-teacher conference.
Blake Barrington, Communications Specialist. I've been with the district for a year and a half.
Everyone wave to Blake. All right, and then we have guests in the room that we want to make sure we've got some experts here with us, so Dan, would you mind?
You bet. Dan Weigmiller. I'm with Specialized Public Finance. I'm the financial advisor that works with the district during bond issues. I've worked with the district since '92. Also graduated from the district in 1987. We were a class of 66 kids back then. And for most of that, we were all in the administration building.
Wow.
That was it. So.
Did you think that building was old then?
Yes. Absolutely. My mom was a secretary in the office, and so she can.
We're still using her desk.
Yeah.
That's probably true. All right, Daryl, if you'll come up, I want to introduce Daryl. So Daryl Pearson is with PBK, and we recently slipped their arms back here to help us with our pre-bond planning and communications. And so he's going to be a good partner for the district in this process. So you'll see him a lot, and then Jennifer, if you'll come. I'm going to hand over the remote to Jennifer, who's been on previous steering committees and was on long-range facility planning, and is going to help us chair and kind of facilitate this process.
And Ian, I'll introduce myself for a second. I've been in the community for approaching 20 years. Raised our kids here. They're both in college now. We've loved being here. I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to support the district through this process. So what I'll be, Jennifer is going to serve as our committee chair. And what that means is she's going to help steer us in the right direction, make sure on the front end of this, we all understand what our charge is at the beginning of each meeting, the beginning of each meeting. Make sure we're doing the right things we need to do as a committee. And at the end of each meeting, making sure that we've tallied questions, things that we have. So we'll run through some of that, but just in general, just as we go through these first slides here, we're going to walk you through what expectations are, what your role and responsibilities are, and just a few tidbits to remember so you'll understand what are we doing, what are we trying to accomplish with this effort. So let's go and get started.
All right. And we're going to start, and I'm going to tell y'all, I apologize, I didn't join the tour. I was coming in really quickly from out of town, so this is my driving outfit. So Daryl's going to jump in every time that he needs to get us through these first few slides. But what we have here, because I know y'all didn't have your binders in advance, is this committee charge. And if you want to take a second, if you haven't had a chance to read it, the lawyer in me breaks it down, so we really have 4 things up here in this first paragraph that we've got to really hone in on. And then, that's what we're going to do for the next several meetings. Really important, collaborative effort. And so that's just something for us to refer back to during this whole process.
And just so everybody's aware, let me just give you a little orientation of your binders. So everybody takes a look at their binder. You have 8 tabs. We're going to have 6 meetings. So you have, as you show up each week, your tabs will be populated. So as behind tab number 1, you have the agenda for this evening. It's printed front and back. So the back has a section for notes, and then you have all of our meetings from now through the end of this process. And you've got the front side, which tells you the agenda and what we're going to cover this evening. Before we finish tonight, we'll talk about what we're going to cover the next meeting. Just in a minute, I'm going to give you some context for what's going to happen through this entire process so you understand where we're going to end up once we're done. So everybody's got a binder. Every week, your tab will be populated. So we'll take these up after we're done. Take your notes. When we're done, you'll take your name tag and take your little table topper with your name, put it in the fold, in the little sleeve. We're going to take those up and we'll have them back populated with the next meeting's agenda and the next meeting's slide presentation, so you have that with you. If anybody wants any of this, we're going to cover this in just a few minutes. It'll be accessible online, and we can provide content to you at any time if you need it. But just so you know, that's what your binders are for, and that's what will be in your binders.
Okay, and then some of this we've got, we just covered. This is all going to be there in the binder. The committee roster, I think you said, is not in here.
Yeah, so we have a committee roster. So we now have our tables set. We have had a couple of changes, so it's not in your binder. It'll be on the website. We'll show you the link in a minute here. But we will be, by the next time you show up or before that, it'll be emailed to the committee. The roster, who's at what table, everybody's introduced themselves, but you'll know who's where as we move through this process.
Yeah, and then also I think it'll be helpful on your sticky notes, unless you're going to email Holly, just the days that you can't be here. If you know, go ahead and put it on there, and then that way we'll have that in advance. We're doing no breaks. because it's a 2-hour time period and it's your Wednesday evening, so you need to get up, take a phone break, a body break. I don't know where the restroom is, but I'm going that way.
Restrooms are immediately, you walk out the door here, immediately to your left, there's 2 staff restrooms.
Okay, perfect. Oh yeah, and this is the website that Daryl mentioned. So all of the information, all of our information will be on there. So again, once that roster is printed, if there's something wrong on there with spelling or other information, just let us know. The meeting agendas, this is all for the public. The public can come to this meeting as well. It's all posted and available to everyone.
And so if anyone ever asks you, because you're the representative for the committee that will ultimately make a recommendation potentially to the board, let people know, there's this site, the things we're recording here, the things that we're providing to you, all these communications, very open and available to anyone.
Okay, and here's the list of meetings, and this I think was emailed to y'all in advance as well.
And it's in your binders.
Yeah, so we'll remind you at the end, but next week we're going to be over at Dripping Springs Elementary. The 4 Wednesday meetings, including today, right? And then they're in July, 2 meetings, and then trying to get to the board, the recommendation by the end of July.
And so before we go to the next slide, let me just talk about the progression of the meetings, what you can expect. So tonight, you're going to hear this overview of where we're going. You're going to hear a little discussion and a little presentation from Holly about what took place with something most of you participated in, or many of you did, the Long Range Facility Planning Committee. And then you're going to hear a presentation about School Finance 101. School finance is a fairly complicated thing, so it's very important in this process to have that presented to you up front. To break it down, it's difficult for people who deal with school finance. So for the layperson that doesn't, it's something that needs a clear understanding, so everybody has a simplistic understanding of what school finance is about and how funding happens and how that impacts the school district, bond referendums, tax rates, those sorts of things. So you'll have a presentation about that tonight. Then as we progress through this, and you have this schedule of meetings, but then in the next meeting, number 2, you're going to hear demographics. So that's been presented before to the board, it's been presented to committees. However, you can have an understanding of demographics, projected growth in the district, so you can see, reiterate why we're doing this. And then you're going to have a presentation of the overall facility needs. And if I think about those in 4 categories that you'll see them in. One is the summary of what the Long Range Facility Planning Committee recommended and brought forward. Then what the life cycle needs are in the district for facilities, all the existing facilities on the ground, roofs, HVAC units, things that are expiring, past their useful life, etc. What that looks like. And then a list of departmental needs. What do the coaches need? What does the fine arts department need, etc. What are some key departmental needs that the district has identified? And then what are district-wide needs? Safety and security, some things that span across the entire district. So you'll see a presentation next week that covers those items so you have an understanding of what the real need is that the district's looking for this committee to help distill down, but to potentially ultimately recommend and package a bond. So I'm not going to run through each meeting, but if you culminate, work your way to meeting number 5, this will move pretty quickly. The goal would be then for you to see that list, make some recommendations about that list with dollars eventually attributed to them. And so you'll see in meeting 4, this will then be brought to you with dollars, so this committee can start to understand what does it look like from a community threshold standpoint in terms of size of a bond. What do these start to look like in terms of the cost? And so we're going to have a deliberation night in meeting number 5, and then this committee will then develop, here's our list, here's how big we think this bond referendum would be, and then package that to recommend that to the Board of Trustees for consideration. So that's where this will end up, and that's what your purpose is here, is to ultimately make some decisions based on information you're provided, dollars you're provided, and have a clear understanding of what you all feel is best representing this community to recommend to your trustees so that they could consider a bond referendum.
Okay, and then just like today, there's going to be a light meal provided at 5:30, tour the facility we're at, and then get into the meeting, with the exception of when we get to meeting 5. I think that changes, because we're going to meet a little earlier, because it's
Yes,
no
ma'am.
longer deliberation.
One thing about tours, let me just give a little context for tours, and we probably should have done that before you started. The purpose of tours, and we're going to be at different facilities, is so you can understand and walk and hear considerations that you might want to, the district might want you to pay attention to relative to needs of an individual facility or needs that are across the district, but using an individual facility as an example. There haven't been any preconceived notions about design, shape of things, color of things, materials, any of that. Your goal for walking these is to have context, to understand what are the needs of the district is dealing with them and has identified them, and then what, so you, as you go to deliberate eventually and evaluate the things that I described, you have some context for what the district's challenges are and what they're dealing with in their existing facilities.
And that's really important. I mean, if you're like me, my kids only went to 3 different schools here, so I came in the wrong door here tonight. So it's good to see all the schools and doors. So again, you know, it's hard and quick, but as much as you can be here, best. I know Polly wants us to try not to miss any meetings, but just let us know, and then your responsibility to catch up. All the information will be in the binder, but the binders are staying here, so that website, you can access all those materials if you miss, and, you know, I'm sure anybody, I'll help out and get any information anybody needs it. Okay?
Yes, ma'am.
All right.
So I'm going to talk about how we'll make decisions, and I touched on some of that, but I'll just come back to it. Simplistically, I won't read bullets for you, but you're going to go through this process, get a quick understanding of School Finance 101. What are the list of things that the district has identified, in addition to what the Long Range Facility Planning Committee has identified? Get your hands around what all that is, and then start to understand priorities of those as the district has identified them, and then evaluate those from your perspective, from a priority standpoint. Then understand what does all that cost, what does that look like relative to capacity, and then start to package that up. So the way we'll make decisions is there will be a deliberation night in meeting number 5. That will be the culmination of these very quick 4 meetings in advance of that. So that's why attendance is very important, because you're going to ultimately have a deliberation night where you're actually packaging that bond. After meeting number 4, we'll send you home with some homework, because that week's going to be really important for you to come prepared to really package a bond referendum for a recommendation.
Hand this back over.
So I'm going to cover how did we get here. For some of you, this is, you know, what you've been living with us, and for some of you, it's new, but I want to make sure we're all kind of on the same page with what led us to having this conversation. So there was a long-range facility planning committee that the district had, and it actually started in 2019. And it was really formed to look at our future growth, to begin to examine things like the past projections and see where we were headed and make a really good plan for our district. At that time, it had staff, teachers, parents, and then various other stakeholders, some of our principals and assistant principals, some of our construction staff, those types of team members were all a part of this committee, making sure that they were looking at what's our long-range kind of expectations for our district and where we're headed and how can we be ahead of the growth that was coming. They had 5 meetings during 2019-2020, and then COVID happened, and they hit pause. And when I started in the district, we had students re-enrolling, and we saw quickly that we were really gaining the enrollment back that had dipped a little bit during COVID. So there was this pause in the district, and it picked right back up at the start of the school year. So pretty quickly we said we have got to get this committee back. Because they had done so much great work and had already been through 5 really productive meetings, that same committee came back together and picked up that work. There were a few people who had moved out of district or were no longer available, so we added a few committee members and started that work again in October. We had another 6 meetings. And then that was really around kind of looking at the new data, because we had some new enrollment data to tell us where we were headed and to think about what next for our district. At that time, we were noticing some new things with, for example, this campus and the changes at this campus. So middle school growth became kind of one of the key issues that hadn't been a key issue in 2019. So there were some minor changes then to priorities that the committee was suddenly seeing based on where the district was last year. So the most pressing challenges were identified, talked a lot about various solutions. That website still exists, so if you hadn't been on that committee, had any interest in the historical work, there's actually 6 tabs that go through each of the committee's recommendations and gives you kind of detailed information about the conversations that were happening. All of that's recorded, all of the agendas are there, so much like this meeting, you'll see all of that packaged up throughout this process. But that's ultimately through that process how we came up with 6 recommendations that were pretty big recommendations when we think about them. When you start talking about a high school, when you start talking about expanding a middle school, and you need an elementary school, we're talking, touching 3 campuses now. And so at that point then, we knew we had to go out for bonds. We knew that that was a bigger project and something that would fit even in the prior bond funds. And so that brings us here to kind of having this conversation about how do we keep moving forward. So wanted to make sure that the committee knew, since that time, the recommendations were shared and further vetted with our community. So we had 4 community meetings, we had a survey, and all of that data went out, and some of that's going to be part of the conversations that we have here about similarities and differences between that, but overall looking at these 6 recommendations. So the recommendations that ultimately came out were build elementary school number 6. We had 2 different size middle schools, and so it was figuring out what's the right capacity for our middle schools. With our long-term growth, the 1,200 capacity makes sense. So we're looking at building future middle schools at 1,200. Comprehensive second high school, purchasing land, expanding this campus, and then modify Tiger Stadium. And modify Tiger Stadium is the last one on this list and one of the most interesting ones because the community survey came back a little bit different than our recommendation. They'd like for you to consider potentially adding a second stadium. So that'll be an interesting part of the conversation. I think as a committee, we were pretty well rounded on modify the stadium we have, and one facility can work for teams across our district. But it's an interesting differential point, so we'll be able to share that with you and talk a little bit about that. And I think that's part of your work, right? Is the differences between that committee and coming to this committee is really making sure that we take all of those pieces into account and continue this conversation on with y'all now. So especially for those of you who are continuing on or into 11 long-range facility planning meetings and now another 5-6 meetings, I want to say thank you so much for serving. I know that's a lot of time to serve your district, and we really appreciate it and wish I could give you more than a sandwich. So this is the process that we're at. So the committee convened, we had those recommendations that went to the board. The board said, yes, let's go out and validate that. Out of that, we formed this committee because we felt like that work is going. We've been talking a lot about this in our community since the Long-Range Facility Planning Committee had their recommendations come together. And so that conversation is happening really well. We want to keep that momentum about this conversation and keep us on that path of talking as a school district and a school community about what do we need so that we can get ready to make sure that our campuses are expanded and that we bring the campuses online that our kids need in the right amount of time. And so the next steps for us would be that you build the bond package based on these, that goes to the board, that they accept, reject, or modify our recommendations from this committee, and then they either call for a bond election or they send us back to the drawing board. So that's kind of what's next. And so far we've lived at this top line and we've moved now into phase 2 and a whole new part of the process. All right. And Dan, I think this is you for bond.
Yes. So bond history, and it's really interesting when you think about, we're going to just touch on how many different bond elections were held here in the district back through to 1996. One thing that's in common with each bond election is capacity. I started working with the district in '92, but obviously growing up here, which is very unique. Every election that passed that I worked on since '92, we always want to hit our targets, the interest rates that we're projecting, the timing, get everything done on budget, on time, get all that issued. For me, the unique piece is I always had to go to my parents' house and make sure the tax rate never went above what we projected. The interest rates were never going above because my dad was very keenly interested, like all of you, in taxes and where everything went. But this district, since it started doing bonds, always kept hitting capacity because it was a residential area. There was not all the commercial, retail, different things that are going on. So as we go through these numbers, there's some kind of consistency to things that the district faced each and every time. One thing just about bonds in general, you do not, as a school district, have some flexibility that cities, counties do when they face needs. If you want to expand or if you want to renovate, modify a Tiger Stadium, cities, counties have some non-voted debt options that they can go do some short-term debt without voter approval on typically non-discretionary type items, things that need to get done. A bridge washes out, a facility has damage from either aging or whatever the issues are, ADA. School districts, you have to go to the voters each and every time. The exception is you can do maintenance tax notes for up to 20, 25 years for repairs and renovations. But as a Chapter 41 district, anytime you put something on that M&O side, and I'm not going to steal Catherine's thunder, but it's subject to the recapture. So the debt side is a piece that you're always protected from recapture and sharing that. And so that's one important point. The other thing that's changed is how the propositions are structured, and that'll come more later, but historically there's always been just like one proposition. You put all your variety, trying to touch on either all businesses or all interests. You're trying to make sure there's something for everybody within every bond election, if possible, and if the need is there. And you could just put those all in one bond package, vote it, and that was typically the way most school districts have done it. The legislature has changed that. Now you have to break out certain pieces. And again, they'll get into that as we move through looking at different elements and getting further down the line. But it's important to note that all the history on the bond elections come from a place where most of it, you decided what to recommend, the board decided to call the election, and it was one proposition that went forth. One thing I want to note on this, the 2018, $132 million, at the time the tax rate was, for debt service, was 35 cents. There was a swap that had occurred where M&O went up, INS went down. So 35 cents was what was structured around at that time. Total tax rate was $1.52 at the end of that, in 2018. For comparison purposes, tax rate now is $1.3103, and I know the budget's in process right now. So the tax rate's always been part of the guiding force behind these elections. The other thing with the amounts was simply looking at the time frame. How far out do you want to look? As a growing district, there's a combination of how far do we want to look, but again, kept reverting back to capacity. 132 was about the max capacity that was available within a 3 to 5 year time frame. The other part is not only project costs, you don't want to go too far out, set a number, and then inflation, which we're experiencing, front and center right now, you don't have enough money, you have to come back. I've got a number of districts that have voted bonds over the last year to 2 years, and they're trying to come up with 10, 15, 20% of the budget. And the only way to come up with that is to raise fund balance or to go back to the voters. And you can only imagine what it's like to turn around and have to go back in spite of knowing where rates are and what's been going on. So 2018, 132 million. 2014 was 92.4 million. And again, just a variety, trying to touch different campuses, different things that was going to be impactful and try to get all the interested parties out. The INS rate back then was 48 cents, and the total rate for the district was $1.49. Most of these elections all had minimal to no tax rate increase. One of the things the district's been working on for a number of years is managing that debt service tax rate. And we structured debt service payments on each bond issue to kind of go for the conservative projection in values, not to bet on a lot of growth and things coming down the pipeline, because if you don't get it, like in 2008, when things kind of stalled out a little bit, you don't want to have the tax rate going up. Conversely, if you do have good growth, you do have bonds that are callable, and we're going to be, the district will be calling over $5 million in bonds early this year and paying it off early. It's in order to keep the tax rate where it's at, pay that debt off, and stop the interest clock ticking. It also helps with capacity, gives you more room if you can pay some stuff off early. Again, 2014, 92.4, and that was the capacity number back then, based on values, new values, and what the district could really afford. 2007, 96.2 million. And I know a couple of these elections, and you can see the extent of 96 million went to these two items and the others. So it was a big shift. 96 million in 2007, I think there's a little shift in timing. Part of the bond election process was getting a committee together. Each time there's the same type of process, generally speaking, that the district went through. And then 2005, and in 2007, 45 cent was the INS rate, the rate for debt, and $1.6801 was the overall tax rate. And I'm just giving you the tax rates so you can see part of the tax rates for the district is so driven by compression, legislative changes, different things that have happened, and again, will be discussed a little more, but most of these were done with very little tax rate change, trying to build and do what was needed within the capacity or within probably 3 to 5 cents. So 2005, 28.8 million. This election also was delayed a little bit, just looking at timing. How long could you make existing facilities work? And when did you need to go to the voters for the improvements? This time, it's just kind of interesting to hear the INS rate for debt was 32.6 cents. So you can see how much, just from year to year, this wasn't being driven just by the values, it's being driven by changes in state funding that really, you had to adapt to each and every time. Overall rate was $1.7465. Finally, the 96 bond, and this again was 24.7 was pushing the limits back then. I remember because I started in 92, and I was just carrying bags for the banker I worked for, and but we were scrapping everything, trying to be creative to see how much you could get up, and 24.7 million was absolutely it. Tax rate back then was 48.68 cents. The max you can go to at the time of issuance is 50 cents. So we were maxing out at that time, but then growth happened and never had to hit 48.68 cents. The high for the district was 1999 with a $1.97 tax rate, and this is the low at $1.31. The one thing I was just going to mention before passing the baton on is the interest rates, the values, and we're going to talk on capacity at a later meeting, but it's something I want to continue, I always put out there, because you have a laundry list of what you need, but just like buying a house, car, anything you're buying, you kind of want to know budget before you get excited about what you're looking at and what you want to see done, and balance that, and also know when you sell bonds, you have a 3-year window basically to spend the money before the IRS really starts questioning your pace of spending. There's not huge penalties if you miss the timing, because that happens from time to time. But that's part of the process, is once you vote an amount, if it's a larger amount, we may sell it all, or we may sell it in 2 tranches. we've, for the last probably 6+ months, we've seen interest rates come up over 170 basis points. So instead of selling at 2.5%, we're selling at, around 4 to 4.25% right now. That's a big move up. What I will say is, about 8 or 9 years ago, 10 years ago, we were celebrating selling at 4% because we were coming down and it kept trending down. So it's all relative. When I started in '92, in the early 90s, we sold 20, 25-year bonds around 6%. We were refinancing 8, 9, 10% bonds. Hopefully we don't go there, but it's all relative. The need drives the bonds, the timing drives the bonds, but we certainly want to be able to try to fit everything within the tax rate we promised, because if this leads to a November election and we sell the first tranche in January, February, if we moved 170 basis points from December, there's the potential to move hopefully back down, but it could move up throughout this process. We'll keep you updated and look at these numbers and just manage expectations. So.
I don't know who put the softball slide on the public school finance 101, but I was a varsity softball athlete at Westlake, so this feels like it's coming full circle for me from my days as a public school student to now being your public servant, so it's very honoring to me. Anyway, I'm Catherine Knapp, the Assistant Superintendent for Finance and Operations, and this is one of my favorite subjects, so feel free to ask any question you'd like. So first of all, let's just talk about the two pots of money, because I think that's something that's really important to keep in mind, is that there's a clear demarcation between money you can spend for basic maintenance and operations, and then money you can spend for interest and sinking, which is all the things we're going to be talking about over the next several meetings. So this is money that is raised through one set of tax rate, and then this is money that's raised through the INS rate. And maintenance and operations is subject to recapture. INS is not subject to recapture. So that's something to keep in mind. So we're really going to be focused in on this section. But I'm going to go briefly through what all goes into maintenance and operations, just so you have a little bit of an idea. So first of all, general fund revenues, that's talking about the maintenance and operations side of things. And there's three main buckets of funding, but the biggest is your local in Dripping Springs. Y'all are all fully aware of how high your taxes are. That is a subject to your property values, which we do not set. I get just as surprised at the property value growth as you do when you open up your bill. I get the property value statements from Laura Reagan, the appraiser, and this is how we base our budget off of expected tax collections based upon a rate that the state helps set for us. And there's all these state aid words we'll go into more detail about a little bit later, but this is basically additional supplementary funds on top of what we collect in taxes and other pieces of local revenue. So every time you go to the football game, for example, that actually does help us pay teachers. And then last but not least is the federal source. We do have a bunch of federal money that is outside of the general fund. Some of those Title I funds you hear about. This is slightly different, and this can be used for general fund purposes. Just to give you an idea of the split from the last slide in terms of the buckets of those three sources, you can see the giant maroon section is property taxes, which are subject to recapture. So while we might take in all of this amount of funding, we don't get to keep all of this funding. So that's why it's really important to talk about debt service not being subject to recapture. And then we have the impact of tax revenue on state funding. That's one of the things that I think people really get curious about when it comes to public school funding is, wow, we have these huge property values. Why do we not have these, state-of-the-art everything? Because our property tax bills are huge. Well, it's because the state tells us how much we're entitled to keep, and it sets a limit on how much that is. And every dollar in excess of that gets recaptured by the state. So there's a formula for that, and that's as high as we can go. And there's small ways to make adjustments to that in the state funding formulas, but there's really a small band of how much discretion you have to raise additional funding. And there's always trade-offs in terms of how much you actually get to keep. And then, so if you're in a less property value, wealthy area, you'll see a little bit more state revenue than we do, but, you know, we're in good company here in the Central Texas region of not having a lot of state aid, and it's because we're financed primarily through our tax collections. Okay, so speaking of tax collections, this is the general trend of what's happened to taxable values over the last 5 years. So you can see this is what we've all been experiencing and feeling. And there's all these technical terms about post certification, certified, preliminary, all of these kind of different reports. We received our preliminary values in April from the appraisal district. And y'all are all probably avidly protesting your values and submitting those protests to the appraisal review board, or you probably should have already submitted them by now. And so we'll see some of those those values change over the course of the summer. So that $9.75 billion is your preliminary value. It may come down a little bit. Just wanted to show you that we're kind of mixing sources here a little bit because of trying to get current value information here.
Where is that rank? Sorry to interrupt.
No, ask away, ask
Okay.
away.
So where does that rank with, like Travis ISD, with some of the other counties?
In terms of property value growth, I'd say in the Central Texas area, we're definitely, this is very normal. In fact, Chris, there's a spreadsheet of all of the sort of local area CFOs have put together generally what your property value growth is, and we can take a look at that. So we have kind of survey data.
Not just the growth, but I guess the preliminary, the 9.75, so where's that? Are we pretty much in the same range as the other school districts?
I think it depends. We have very expensive rooftops, but other school districts have a lot of industrial value, and it also depends on the geographic size. So I think that's a good question. I'm not exactly sure in terms of property value where we stand, but relative to it's really your value relative to the number of students that you have too. Is an important thing to keep in mind. For example, Enos has a whole lot more property value, but we're about to surpass them in the number of students, and that really does have an effect on how much money you get to keep in the school district.
On the $9.75 billion, I know it's preliminary, do they have an approximate percentage of, every year we know we send out and approximately, 5% of that is reduced? Do they have some sort of percentage on that?
They do have an approximation of how much value is lost to the appraisal review board process. And since this is a net taxable value, that of course doesn't take into account adjustments for frozen properties as well. But it's around 8% is what they were saying preliminarily, but you just never know with high value increase this year, whether that won't get totally changed.
Okay.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, one more.
Nope, go ahead.
And so when I looked at my taxes, for example, my taxes increased more than 10%. So that $9.75 billion, is that the basis of actual taxable value because it cannot increase more than 10%, or is it what the property value adds? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. So your net taxable value is gonna have taken away exemptions and homestead caps. So this is net of.
Okay, so it would increase that. Okay.
Yeah, your market value may have increased quite a bit beyond 10%, but this shows the reflection of that discount for your homestead caps. Oops, didn't know we could do that. Okay.
Don't zoom in on this year.
Wow, okay, so then we have average taxable value of a DSISD residence. So this is an interesting statistic because it's based off of some information that's based on category properties, usually single-family home properties. So it's a decent concept. There's some other ways to look at this, but I think it does a pretty good job of showing you generally your average taxable value of residents over time. So we've definitely felt this, right? That your house has gotten more expensive over the last several years. This is kind of an interesting factoid.
Okay, now let's talk about, public school funding in general. We're talking about general fund, maintenance and operations here. This doesn't have anything to do with long-term debt that we'll really be focusing in on. But, I think that the thing about public school funding is there's tiers. Think of it like a wedding cake, really, where you have your main huge tier at the bottom, and this forms the substance of the basic educational program that you have. So basic allotments for regular education, special education, compensatory education, which is basically trying to bring economically disadvantaged students up to sort of a more average playing field. Career and tech, bilingual, gifted and talented. There's certain dollar amounts per student that the district receives, so we keep counts of all of these kids and then send those numbers to the state, and then they send us money based upon how many kids we have in each one of these categories. And there's a sort of a basic amount that every kid gets, and then there's additional weights depending on the need for the students. So mainstream special education students receive about 15 hundreds more than a student without this particular educational need. And then all of this is based on attendance, not enrollment. So that's important. There's a lot of discussion about why it's good for your kids to come to school for learning purposes. It also happens to be good for funding purposes. Now, tier 2, this is an essential part of the cake, right? A wedding cake isn't or a birthday cake isn't special unless you have a second layer, right? Otherwise, it's just too basic. Well, same thing here, funding beyond basic programming. This isn't supplementary in the sense of, gilding the lily. This is really an essential part of what we do. And there's one tax rate that the state sets that's tier 1, and there's another portion of that M&O tax rate that's set based upon this tier 2 values. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with that, but the important point is that this really produces essential funding for students and education. This isn't something magical that we add on top that's really excessive. This is something that we rely upon just for basic operations. So a guaranteed yield for funding based upon additional pennies of tax ever. You have to vote initially for these pennies to be levied, but then you get to keep them. If you choose to cut your tax rate, you have to vote to get them added back on. So that's just something to keep in mind when we talk about tax rates and tax relief, is that when you give these pennies up, you give them away unless you want to go through another election again. So we like to keep the ones that we have. Okay, now, available school fund, all of that first part, that was just basically the formula for how you arrive at how much money you get. This is just a factoid to say that this is one of the revenue streams that we're guaranteed that is not subject to recapture by the state. And so we get a per student amount every year, and the State Board of Education is who adopts that. Can I ask a question? Yes, ma'am. Is there any reason that it decreased from the 2021 to the 21-22 year? Has the state decided that, or?
So yes, this is part of the state budget, and it depends on, let's see, generated by both the state's fuel tax and the permanent school fund. So if we have, things change in terms of fuel taxes, then, that generates a smaller number. The state board can.
Essentially, when they cut the fuel taxes at the state level, it cuts.
That may have something to do with it. I think there's a number of different factoids, but the permanent school fund was established, I think, in the 19th century when they knew that they needed to have a guaranteed public education system. They had basically an investment fund that they set up then that continues to pay into the system, but not a whole lot of money. So right now, this is about $3 million. So a very small piece of the pie. But we get to keep it, so we like that. There goes. Okay, so that was a very quick run through maintenance and operations, but just that's what funds what we do on a day-to-day basis. Now let's talk a little bit about debt service. So debt service is basically, think of it more like how you pay for the mortgage on your house.
So it's something that you pay off over a long period of time for something that's very valuable. And it's not something that you use to pay to necessarily, fix the pipes within your, one little bathroom. You might take out a loan or something if you want to do a major renovation. And so the loan for the major renovation would be the debt service piece, just like your mortgage. So funds collected can only be used for the repayment of debt service, so an annual principal and interest payments. Funds cannot be used to pay salaries, utilities, etc. So one of the things that Dan talked about with the tax swap, you might have heard that, the penny swap and drop, you're not allowed to do those anymore. You can't take pennies from one side and then purposefully change them over to the other side. The Texas legislature has forbidden that. So that's one thing. Doesn't mean you can't decrease everything overall, but you can't just simply swap pennies. And may only be used if the district receives voter approval. So you can't just go out like Dan was mentioning, like the cities, and choose to make some changes infrastructurally because you need to. You have to go to the voters first. Under current state mandate, districts may set an INS tax rate not to exceed 50 cents per $100 valuation. So DSISD currently has 35 cents. There's a calculation that's done every year at the end of the summer once we get certified values that allows us to continue to levy this rate, but only if we commit to defeasing debt early. We can't just arbitrarily keep our rate at that level. We do have to commit to responsible paying off of debt, even if our mortgage payment for that year dictates that we don't need to spend that much. So that's always a good question that people have is, well, if we're collecting way more taxes than we need to pay for that annual principal and interest payment, what are we doing with it? Well, we're paying it off early. And that helps us at that rate and be able to afford the structures that we need.
Even at low interest rates? So I'm just thinking the next bond's gonna be at probably a higher interest rate than we're currently at.
Right.
So we're actively paying down lower interest rate debt.
Well, Jamie can answer this question a little bit.
Yeah, so for example, the bonds that we're paying off this year, we look at the schedule of what's outstanding. There are some bonds that have 5% coupons on them, so we pick those. Typically, we also look at, you're right, the new debt's going to be higher than some of the other debt, but each year, as Catherine was saying, these are 20, 25-year bonds typically, so each year carries a different interest rate. So we do two things. We look to pay off the most expensive debt, but we also, school districts are unique. We also have to be mindful of what you may need capacity-wise. It may be better to pay off something that's due in 20 years at a higher interest rate, but if you come through this process and come up with more money that you need than what you can support, we might pick some maturities that are in the next 5 years to help the new bonds come on. So it's a give and take.
More like cash flow.
Exactly. Sometimes it's cash flow, which is capacity for schools, and then sometimes it's just pure savings. So we look at those each and every year when we do the defeasance.
Otherwise you're actually legally bound to be able to pay off. You have to say that you're going to pay things off early, otherwise you can't legally justify that rate. So just to understand, we can pay off bonds in any order we want?
You can pay off any bonds that are callable.
Okay.
So when you sell a 20 or 25-year bond, the first 8 or 9 years, you can't pay them off early. Beyond that, they're callable. So you get to pick what you pay off, when you pay it off, and then how much you want to pay off. Sometimes it's a partial maturity, partial set of bonds. So we do defeasances every year that, this is not unique to Dripping Springs. This is anywhere that's in a fast growth area that is truly trying to manage not having the tax rate drop for 2 years because you don't need facilities and values have gone up, and then turn around and have to ask for the tax rate back up. So the district controls what they pay off and when they pay it off.
And one thing that's important to note is unlike the M&O side where you literally vote for particular pennies to be levied, you don't vote for levies to be you don't vote for pennies to be levied. You vote for an amount of debt that you want to take on, and then the school district levies a rate to pay that off in the amortization schedule that it is committed to. So if for some reason our values went really, really low, which won't happen, but if it went really, really low, we could actually charge for levy, we would be bound to levy more than 50 cents in order to pay off that debt.
And that's a great point, because there are other states in which change and migration of people in. Some states vote a mill levy, not bonds. So if they're calling for 200 million, the ballot may say mill levy. So if you ever get the question from friends or neighbors that have moved in from other states, we vote bond amounts, which then have a related tax rate that we think will be needed. Other places will vote a mill levy, and you can issue up to whatever that amount is.
So yeah, that's how, just M&O operates a little differently than INS in terms of the rate, but there is a calculation that they've approved that we're actually going to spend the tax collections that we bring in. Okay. Okay, so just to give you an idea of our tax rate history, you'll notice that we were at $1.04 for some time, and then the voters decided to increase the pennies, right? That's why the 13-cent jump. And then we cruised along at $1.17 for a while, and then, wow, House Bill 3 happened. And when House Bill 3 occurred, the state decided to compress tax rates. So basically what that meant is it was inserting some state aid so that you wouldn't have to levy as high of a tax rate. So it just said, we're gonna buy these pennies basically from you and suppress your rate all the way down to this $1.683. Remember I was talking about that layer cake? It then says, okay, as your property values grow, we're gonna compress your tax rate similar to your property value growth. And there's a little bit of a limit on how much that tax rate can be compressed, but it's just going to continue to go down now that the tax law has been changed. It's going to continue to decrease as our property values continue to increase. So you'll see that relationship there. But in terms of our debt, those things don't get compressed because, like I said, we are committed to paying off a particular value of debt, and that's not subject to the same mechanics as the M&O rate. So here's your total over here. So I think it's important for voters to be paying attention to the pieces of the tax rate and not just the total tax rate number to fully understand the picture. And you can see that here, that breakdown in a color-coded section, that certainly since House Bill 3, our total tax rate has dropped, quite a bit since 2018-19, and that's due to rising taxable values. So again, House Bill 3, the parameters set in House Bill 3 dictate what base tax rates districts should set. So to gain full state aid, districts have to demonstrate a minimum amount of tax effort and levy the lower of the state compressed tax rate or their local maximum compressed rate. So just to make more sense out of this, because all that's confusing, is we have to basically levy this amount if we want to continue to receive all the funding that I talked about in that tier 1 and tier 2. If we go below that, then we're sacrificing state aid and we're increasing our recapture bill. There we go. Okay. Maximum compressed rates are set by the property value growth of the district and therefore vary from district to district. So if you were to go online and see, oh my gosh, this school district, their tax rate is actually less than ours. Well, that may be in part because they adopted fewer pennies than we did. Or there may be a tax rate that's slightly higher than ours, but that's because their property values probably didn't grow as fast as ours did. So it varies. If districts set a base rate lower than the maximum compressed rate, like I mentioned before, then the amount of aid they receive, amount of aid and tax collections they get to keep will be reduced proportionally by how much they are taxing below the minimum amount. So I think that's an important piece to keep in mind. So it's important to point out that school district tax rates are governed by House Bill 3. And cities, counties, and hospital districts are subject to different taxing laws than school districts. So you might hear about this term called the no new revenue rate. And those rates are what govern cities, counties, and hospital districts. Senate Bill 2 did a lot for those particular taxing entities. House Bill 3 is what really has the effect on our tax rates here in the school district. So I think that's something to study up on if you're curious, and I'm happy to answer questions about no new revenue rate. DSISD has adopted the maximum compressed rate as its base tax rate each year since 2019-20, when House Bill 3 took effect. And even though it's called the maximum compressed rate, it's basically the minimum amount of tax rate you have to get full value of your state entitlement for all of those different student accounts. Okay, so that's a lot, very complicated, totally understand that, but if you have specific questions about any of this throughout this process, please feel free to reach out to Holly, and I can answer questions through her or through Carol or whoever you may direct your questions to.
On the maximum compressed rate, if you drop below that rate, you don't avoid recapture, correct?
No, you don't avoid recapture. In fact, what that probably does is you don't avoid recapture, you just get proportionally less money than what you were entitled to receive. So,
I have 2 questions about recapture.
sure.
So question 1, is recapture, is that based on a per-student ratio, or is it district numbers of total? I know you said it's a multi-tiered formula, but is it in general kind of on enrollment, or they just look at the districts?
So I think a really good analogy that's often used, if you have questions about recapture, go to recapturetexas.org. That's a really great webpage to look at. It's not produced by our district. It's produced by an entity that really kind of advocates on behalf of recapture districts. But basically the analogy that constantly gets used is you have a glass, and the size of the glass is a good demonstration for recapture. So basically you have a cup of water. The size of your district entitlement, meaning how much it's going to take to educate all your kids, determines the size of that glass. And so your tax dollars go and fill up that glass. If your tax dollars spill over that glass, all of that money gets sent back to the state. But if I'm in a property value, a property poor district, maybe my water only fills up some portion of that cup, and the state fills in the rest of that glass. But for us, as we grow in student body, that cup gets bigger, so we get to keep more of our tax collections. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, our property values are growing faster than our student population. So while our cup gets a little bit bigger every year, the deluge of water comes faster and faster.
And then my next question is, how much was our recapture bill this year?
This year, it's estimated to be about 10.2 million, and next year it'll be over 20. That's what I'm estimating currently. And all these are estimates, right? Because these things change, the number of kids who show up, every time a kid shows up to school, that's a greater chance our recapture does increase. Not that you wouldn't send your kid otherwise, because I know your kid really wants your kids in class because of learning is important. But it's just something to keep in mind, because everything is driven by attendance. Yes, ma'am?
And do charter schools get paid out of the recapture fund as well, because they are not in a school district per se?
Sort of. So the state creates a budget for public education, and they say, this is how much money, we're gonna commit to Article 3 of the state budget, okay? And so what they do is approximate what that's gonna cost based upon enrollment figures that we actually provide to them as a district, what we project out, and they set that amount. Now, charter schools, because they don't levy a tax, they're actually provided the average state funding regardless of their size. So if you're a very large charter school, you're paid like a 4,000 to 6,000 person district. And so there's economies of scale there, of course, but that's just something to keep in mind is every charter school is funded at about the same.
But that money comes from the recapture monies from the richer districts?
So speaking of recapture monies, recapture basically just sends a whole bunch of money back to the state, and they use that as a method of finance to pay for all of the state aid of everybody. So that might be a low-income school district, or that might be a charter school. But it's not like we're writing a check to Kim, right? We're writing a check to Glenn Hager at the state controller's office. We don't
Who's writing
write
your
a
check?
check, we just wire the money.
That's why
to
you
him.
see a big push on the charter schools to, because they get more money back, so it's better.
So, yeah, we wire the money to them, and then they use, so as recapture grows, the state has to invest fewer of those state sales tax dollars or fuel tax dollars into public education. So we're more and more every year self-funding our own system because of property taxes. To a point where there have been 7 or 8 lawsuits, the school finance consulting group I used to be in, they were the chief witnesses for all of the, what's the word, lawsuits, statewide lawsuits, that argue basically that, some of them argue that we have a statewide property tax, which is actually illegal in the state constitution. So every year there's this sort of tease about whether or not it's technically operating like a statewide property tax, given the fact that we're self-funding our own system.
Alright, I have a bunch of questions on bonds.
Okay.
Sorry, just taking notes, answer questions at the end. What is the current bond rate? I mean, I know this won't be set in stone.
35 cents is what we're currently levying as an INS rate, is that what you're
I
talking
know
about?
the interest rate.
Oh,
Yes.
interest rate.
Yeah, so if you sold today, it'd probably be in the high 3s, so around 4%.
How much do we owe right now in bonded debt?
240 somewhere $1 million.
Around 247, 249 million, I think was in.
Is that an accurate picture of the district's overall debt, or is it more than that? Do we
No.
get in addition to that?
No, that, I mean, from,
We have $190,000 worth of
Leases
debt that
or-
we pay off in general fund debt, but that goes away after this next budget cycle.
Okay, but it's kind of negligible in comparison to.
Very
the other
negligible.
debt.
yeah, because that goes back to, again, the only way to go into debt is to vote bonds, so that's.
Do we have that written down somewhere, like on the website or something where people can?
It's actually on the debt transparency
Okay.
posting that we're required to produce by the state. Or if you go into the financial postings, we have a whole section for this last year, and the debt transparency is right there.
Okay.
Along with our budget from last year has the amortization schedule. You can see what the outstanding bond and debt in this is.
And then do we have any funds remaining from previous bonds currently?
Yes. Clint, where are you? So, yeah, so the bond advisory council, there's many of you in this room, has considered uses for those particular outstanding
Yeah,
bond
so
funds.
the 2018 bond was 132 million. We're getting towards the end of that. As it stands currently, there was about between 8 and 9 million. About half of that, over 4 million of that was money that was set aside for land purchases. So that money will at this point be kept for future land purposes. And then the other roughly 5 million, the bond advisory committee is charged with identifying priorities for those remaining unspent funds.
Okay.
And just along those lines, because I said you typically spend in 3 years, or that's the target, but there's de minimis amounts that IRS doesn't, worry about. Plus, the real thing they worry about is, are you selling bonds to just take the interest off of it and bank the interest? Well, you're not earning any interest right now on the proceeds, so even if you keep it longer, you're not making more than what you're paying.
And that kind of just answered my next question about that 3-year window. And the last question I had was, where are we at with the admin update? Because I know people are going to want to know that as we go through this.
So the last board meeting, go ahead, Clint, do you want to take it or do you want me to take it?
We are, so we're in the GMP, guarantee maximum price development process. At this point, we would be planning to propose a guaranteed maximum price at the next board meeting, and then as soon as the GMP is approved, then that's essentially the go-ahead or the notice to proceed for the contractor to start the project.
Is it already bidded? Like, did we already send this to bid or? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I was just checking that, like, order.
And the bonds that you mentioned in here, were those the only bonds that were proposed, or those just ones passed?
Those were proposed, and I don't believe anything's ever failed out here. Last one was close, but.
On the funding that comes in, does it all go back, when you compare property taxes, it goes to the county? Any of that come directly from the county, or does it all go back to the state and then funded back then?
No, those two, the county, we get it from the county,
County distributes everything back this way.
which is why we have to wire our money to the controller when there's a recapture amount.
And then if the recapture, you send it to the state.
I do, yeah, state controller.
Which is, if you recall, a number of years ago, Wimberley had a recapture payment, and they didn't make, they held it back. And part of it was just to draw attention to what they believed was an inequity. So it comes in and then you have to send it back.
Yeah, and if we don't send a recapture payment in, then there's
Yeah.
all kinds of interesting things that
They
could
ultimately
happen.
sent it in at Wimberley,
Yeah.
but it was more just frustration, I think, locally.
Make a statement.
Yeah, and I think what I understood was bring awareness in the community of how much they were sending away, what the challenge of recapture really is to manage.
The state can choose to annex part of your district to another district if you don't choose to pay a reversion payment. That's the alternative.
So I'm still trying to wrap my head around all this, is a lot of information.
It's a lot, it's a lot.
So, on the M&O, it's subject to recapture. You set that rate, and you wanna have it low enough where you still get state funds to come in. But if you lower it enough where it's an adult operating amount, so there will be no recapture left of it. Or you say there's an amount we had to be at, and that's what's set by the state, so you have to get, it's set by the student population?
That's set by, basically the maximum compressed rate is kind of like saying this, kind of like showing up to a party and you have to bring a covered dish. You don't get to walk into the party if you don't have a covered dish. The covered dish is the maximum compressed rate.
And they do that calculation,
So there, in July, there's a survey called the Local Property Value Survey. And so what that does is we as a district, meaning me, puts into that PBS our property values according to what had just been sent to us by our appraisal district. And we send in that information to the state, and there's a calculation. You can actually go on the TA website right now for the calculator, and it'll say, oh, look, you grew by more than 10%. You're gonna be at this maximum compressed rate. We send it into TEA. They took a look at the information and make sure we're not, making something up. And then they say, yes, here's your maximum compressed rate. And then that's when we go and adopt the tax rate. A lot of fun. And it totally changed the last 3 years because then we used to have this thing called rollback rates and, effective rate calculations and all that kind of stuff.
Do you know off the top of your head, you mentioned it was 249? How much of that is callable that you could buy now? Do you know?
It's gonna be, I would guess, probably at least 50% of it. So there's more debt that you can pay off of it than you'll have funds to do it. So that's why we kind of look through, and again, there's maximum savings to be generated, but there's also what helps if you're in a need for facilities, like in some of these early years I talked about. They couldn't build capacity because the tax rate was almost at 50 cents already.
Do you have an estimated capacity for this potential bond?
That's coming in the end of this month. is a presentation on capacity and how that works.
Is that sorry, I know we talked about it before in long range, the maximum that you talked about, the maximum that the district can take on, is that the number you're discussing?
Yes.
Without raising the tax rate. You can certainly raise the tax rate, not that we want to, but yeah.
And that's where this new preliminary value that came in is a big driver to it, and the certified in July, if you pick up more value, because as was mentioned, some are capped at 10%, but the new houses that are coming in at higher values than what we've seen, those are not capped this year, they'll be capped 10% moving forward.
Okay, all right, sorry, we took a long time, but,
Good.
all right.
So as we'll plan, we're gonna, every week, we're gonna get everybody out of here by 8 o'clock sharp. What that's gonna try to afford us to do, and we're gonna do tonight, is take 10 minutes and have our tables chat with each other for a few minutes. You have Post-it notes there. You've asked some really great questions. School finance is a pretty complex animal. We've also talked about some other topics. We'll wrap up with where we're going next. I'll reiterate what we're doing in our next meeting. We'll take 10 minutes at the tables, chat with each other a bit about what you've heard tonight. Ask any of us around the room questions if you have them. But make sure our goal will be every week to collect your questions. And any questions you have that didn't get answered tonight, or you think about as you chat for the next 10 minutes, capture them, and we will bring answers to you to start the meeting next week. So after 10 minutes, we'll see if you have any questions you need to ask of us. Capture the others that you don't get to ask on a Post-it note. Then we'll revisit those next week and talk about what we're going to do next week. So 10 minutes and we'll gather up again.
One time for everybody. Thank you for coming, but before we really talk out here, just any last minute questions that we want to throw, Daryl, Dan, anybody while we're here?
A quick question, on the recapture, does it automatically, those funds all go back into education, or does the state?
No.
So they're able to do whatever they want with them,
It
right?
it funds the state budget, so it goes to the controller's office and they have budgeted whatever, I mean, all that entitlement, right, the water glasses of every district, if we could overfill all of those water glasses of every district in the state of Texas, the state would keep the leftovers. So if the property values increased, and I mean theoretically, this is a thought exploration, but if the entire property value of the state grew so high that every district could fund itself with tax collections, the state would let it.
Okay.
Now, with the exception of the available school fund, at $400 per kid or whatever, yeah.
Anything else? Okay, we're gonna get to the kind of preview the next meeting, but I just want to remind everybody, we're leaving our binders here, so if you can put your name tag and your little name plate inside your binder, then it will be picked up before we leave. And then also any of your sticky notes, if any of your tables have them, just kind of leave them where they're visible for the rest of the Alright.
And then just one last thing, we'll just cover a reminder of what's going to happen next week, and then we'll get you out of here. So next week, there are two major components of this next phase of this committee's effort. It's going to be a presentation of the demographics. So what's the district look like today, and what's it going to look like a decade from now? What does that projected growth look like? For those of you that haven't seen it, the group that the district has engaged for quite some time does that very accurately. You can see a very clear picture of where the district is going and part of why we're all here. Then the other thing you'll see is a presentation, and I mentioned the categories, I'll just reiterate them, by of items for the bond committee's consideration ultimately, and will be things that came out of the Long Range Facility Planning Committee, those recommendations, which Holly showed here. The life cycle analysis and the things that have to do with keeping these buildings functioning in a healthy way, replacing things that need attention. Then district-wide needs that touch most all of your campuses, and then departmental needs that are requirements for things that have been collected by the district, that are just needs that your department heads, coaches, teachers, principals express that their campuses need because they live with them every day. Those will all be categorized and prioritized so you understand from the district's perspective before you start evaluating them what they've already received, what they've already analyzed, and what they've already understood as a priority from their perspective. So with that, it'll be presented to you so you can start to consider that. We'll have discussion next week around this time about those items, about the demographics, and then field those questions as well. One last reminder, if you have questions that we didn't answer here, leave them on your table on a Post-it note. We'll collect those, answer them as we start next week. I think we're at.
Yeah, we are. And then remember, 5:30 to come eat, so meeting starts at 6 at Dripping Springs Elementary.
Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week.